On a sunny afternoon in Maplewood Park, Ruth Patterson, an elderly community leader, enjoys a rare moment of peace. But when a hostile police officer confronts her without cause, her tranquil world is shattered in an instant. The unprovoked violence leaves Ruth bruised and helpless, sending shockwaves through her small town and igniting a movement. Her son, Marcus, a veteran haunted by his past, witnesses the attack and steps into the spotlight, determined to seek justice for his mother. But as Marcus digs deeper, he uncovers more than just an isolated act of brutality. What he finds is a web of corruption with ties to his own military history and a shadowy figure he once knew all too well. As threats mount and the stakes rise, Marcus must decide how far he's willing to go for justice. Pursue the truth and risk everything he loves, or walk away and let the darkness claim another victim. In Silent Shadows, justice isn't just a fight, it's a battle for survival. Ruth Patterson settled onto a bench in Maplewood Park, a gentle smile lifting the corners of her lips. The sun was warm against her skin, and the sound of children laughing filled the air. It was one of those rare moments when everything felt just right. The world seemed to move in slow motion as she watched the children play tag around the oak trees, their carefree joy reminding her of simpler times. Pulling a scarf tighter around her shoulders, Ruth's thoughts drifted. She had lived in Briarwood for over 5 decades, raised a family, taught generations of children, and stood at the front lines of countless protests and community meetings. Now, at 72, she finally felt she could enjoy the peace she'd fought so hard to create. But as she exhaled a deep sigh of contentment, she felt a presence approaching, the faint crunch of footsteps on the gravel path breaking her reverie. A shadow fell across Ruth, and she looked up to see a tall, young police officer with a stern expression. His name badge read Crowley, and his eyes were as cold as the wind that suddenly picked up, rustling the leaves. "What are you doing here, ma'am?" Ethan Crowley's voice was firm, his stance rigid. Ruth felt a twinge of unease but pushed it aside, keeping her tone polite. "I'm just resting, officer," she replied calmly, her hands folded in her lap. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" Crowley's gaze hardened. "You can't just sit around in this park without a purpose. There are rules." Ruth blinked, taken aback. "I've lived here my whole life. I've always come to this park. There are new policies in place for loiterers," he snapped. "People like you need to follow the rules." "People like me?" Ruth's voice remained steady, but the words stung. Decades of similar encounters, of being told she didn't belong, flashed through her mind. "Officer, I'm not causing any trouble. I'm simply—" Crowley leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "I don't care what you think you're doing. Get up. Now." Ruth's heart began to race, but she remained seated, her eyes meeting his. "I've done nothing wrong," she insisted, her voice as firm as she could manage. The officer's face twisted with annoyance. "I said get up," he shouted, shoving her shoulder. The world seemed to tilt as Ruth's frail body tumbled off the bench. Her hands scraped against the gravel path as she tried to catch herself, but the impact left her dazed. Pain shot through her hip, and she winced, struggling to pull herself up. "Hey!" A voice called from somewhere in the distance. A few bystanders paused, phones raised, recording the unfolding scene. "What are you doing?" another person shouted. But no one moved to help. Crowley stood over her, his face a mask of rage. "This is what happens when you don't listen," he sneered, his hand reaching for his baton. Ruth's heart pounded in her chest. She had seen many things in her life, faced many hardships, but she never imagined it would come to this, being attacked in the very park she had cherished for so long. She opened her mouth to plead, but the pain silenced her. "Help," she managed to whisper, her eyes scanning the crowd. The onlookers were frozen, fear etched across their faces. She tried to lift herself again, but her strength was failing. "Mom!" Marcus Patterson's voice cut through the commotion like a knife. He sprinted across the park, his eyes wide with horror as he saw his mother on the ground. "Get away from her!" he shouted, his fists clenched as he reached them. Crowley turned, his hand dropping to his sidearm. "Stay back!" he barked, his eyes locked on Marcus, but Marcus wasn't deterred. He knelt beside Ruth, his face twisted in anguish as he gently helped her sit up. "It's okay, Mom. I'm here," Marcus said, his voice steady but his hands shaking. He turned a furious glare toward Crowley. "What do you think you're doing?" "This is official police business," Crowley replied, his hands still resting on his holster. She was resisting. "Back off or I'll have to take action." Marcus's eyes blazed with a fierce intensity. Resisting? "She's an old woman sitting in the park." His voice rose, drawing more attention from the gathering crowd. "Put your weapon down, or we'll have a real problem." Crowley hesitated, his fingers twitching on his holster. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and more phones were pointed in his direction. The tension was palpable. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. Marcus's grip on his mother tightened, and his gaze remained fixed on the officer, unflinching. The crowd began to press forward, their voices becoming louder. "Let her go," someone shouted. "Leave them alone," another person added. The murmurs grew into shouts, and Crowley's eyes darted nervously between Marcus and the onlookers. He was outnumbered, and he knew it. Marcus saw the hesitation and seized the moment. "You need to leave now, officer," he said, his tone cold and resolute. "Before this gets worse." Crowley's expression shifted, anger giving way to a flicker of fear. With a last glance at the crowd, he stepped back, his hand dropping from his weapon. "This isn't over," he muttered before retreating down the path, his footsteps quick and unsteady. The moment he was gone, Marcus turned his full attention to Ruth, who was struggling to catch her breath. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice softening. Ruth managed a weak smile, despite the pain. "I'll be all right," she whispered, but her eyes betrayed her fear. Marcus's jaw tightened. "This isn't right. We're not letting this go." He helped her to her feet, and as he guided her toward the exit, the crowd parted for them, offering words of support. "We saw everything," a young woman said, holding up her phone. "We've got your back." "Thank you," Marcus replied, but his eyes were focused ahead. He knew this was just the beginning. As they left the park, Marcus's thoughts raced. He would protect his mother, no matter the cost. But deep down, he knew that confronting the shadows in Briarwood wouldn't be easy. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear. He wouldn't back down. Marcus carried Ruth into the emergency room, his face tight with worry. Nurses rushed to take her from his arms, guiding her to a gurney. Ruth's eyes fluttered open, her hand reaching for Marcus. "I'm fine, son," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to be strong for me, Mom," Marcus replied, holding her hand until the nurses pulled him back. "Just focus on getting better." As they wheeled her away, Marcus was left standing alone, a mix of anger and helplessness coursing through him. The waiting room felt cold and sterile, the sound of monitors and distant voices amplifying his anxiety. He paced back and forth, hands clenched into fists. A doctor approached an hour later. "Your mother is stable," she said, offering a small smile. "She's bruised, but no fractures. We'll keep her overnight for observation." Marcus felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly replaced by the burning need for justice. "Thank you," he said, his voice tense. "But this never should have happened." Ruth, now resting in a hospital bed, reached for Marcus when he entered. "Let it go," she whispered, her eyes filled with concern. "I don't want you getting hurt." Marcus's expression hardened. "I can't, Mom. What that officer did, it's not right. I won't stand by and do nothing." Ruth's grip on his hand tightened. "Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Marcus said, but the determination in his eyes told a different story. The next morning, Marcus walked into the Briarwood Police Department, his jaw set. The receptionist barely glanced up as he approached the desk. "I'd like to file a complaint," he said. She sighed, her fingers tapping at the keyboard. "Name?" "Marcus Patterson," he replied. "It's about an assault that happened yesterday. An officer named Ethan Crowley attacked my mother in Maplewood Park." Her eyes briefly flicked up, registering his seriousness, before she motioned for him to wait. Minutes later, a door opened, and Detective Harold Miles appeared, his graying hair and tired eyes a stark contrast to the younger officers milling about. "Mr. Patterson, follow me," Miles said, leading Marcus into his cramped office. As Marcus sat, Miles closed the door and settled into the chair opposite him. "Tell me what happened." Marcus recounted the events, the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. When he finished, Miles leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "That's a serious accusation. Crowley's a new recruit, but he's already got a record of complaints. Problem is, nothing's ever stuck." Marcus's eyebrows furrowed. "Why not?" Miles sighed. "Briarwood isn't what it used to be. Some officers protect their own, even when they shouldn't. But be careful, Marcus. Filing this report could put you and your mother in more danger." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes piercing. "I'm not afraid. I just want justice." Miles nodded slowly. "I'll do what I can, but watch your back." As Marcus left the station, a chill ran down his spine. Something about the detective's warning felt ominously real. Later that day, Marcus's phone buzzed nonstop. News outlets had gotten hold of the video recorded at the park, and within hours, the footage was all over social media. Reporters called, asking for interviews, and Marcus found himself thrust into the public eye. Standing outside Ruth's hospital room, Marcus hesitated. He knew his mother would disapprove, but he couldn't stay silent. The door opened, and an eager journalist from the Briarwood Times greeted him, microphone in hand. "Mr. Patterson, can you tell us what happened?" Marcus took a deep breath. "My mother was sitting in the park, minding her own business, when Officer Crowley attacked her without cause. This isn't just about one bad cop. It's about a system that allows this to happen." The journalist's eyes lit up. "So, you believe there's a deeper issue here?" Marcus nodded. "Absolutely. And we're going to fight until something changes." As the interview aired, Marcus felt a mix of pride and fear. The community's response was overwhelming. Supportive messages flooded in, and others shared their own stories of encounters with the police. But with the attention came consequences. That evening, Marcus returned to Ruth's house to find the front door vandalized. Spray-painted words scrawled across the wood read, "Drop it, or else." His hands tightened into fists as he scanned the street, the shadows stretching in the dim light. He stepped inside, his heart pounding as he checked each room. No one was there, but the message was clear. As he stood in the living room, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Back off, or your mother won't be so lucky next time." Marcus's eyes narrowed, and he shoved the phone into his pocket. A wave of anger surged through him, but when he heard the door creak, he turned, ready to defend his home. It was Ruth, looking pale and tired. "Marcus, what's wrong?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room. He forced a smile. "Nothing, Mom. Just making sure everything's okay." He didn't want her to know about the threats. Not yet. Ruth's eyes softened as she reached out, touching his arm. "Promise me, son, that you won't go looking for trouble." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Trouble already found us, Mom. We can't just ignore it." Ruth sighed, the weight of worry deepening the lines on her face. "Just be careful." As she walked away, Marcus knew he couldn't back down. If they were willing to threaten his mother, then he had to be ready for anything. The next day, Marcus received a call from Detective Miles. "We need to talk." Privately, they met at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. Miles looked more tired than usual, his eyes darting around the room before settling on Marcus. "Crowley's actions aren't isolated," Miles began, leaning in. "There are officers in this town who protect each other, even when they cross the line. It's been going on for years, and anyone who tries to speak out gets shut down." Marcus's eyes darkened. "So, what you're saying is there's a cover-up?" Miles nodded. "I've seen it before, but it's bigger than just one officer. Some of these men have ties to powerful people, people who won't hesitate to make threats." Marcus's fists clenched under the table. "They already have." Miles sighed. "I figured. That's why I'm telling you to be careful. If you push too hard, they'll come for you and your mother. You need to gather evidence, but you need to stay smart about it." Marcus's eyes were cold and resolute. "I appreciate the warning, but I'm not backing down." Miles nodded. "I'll help where I can, but you need to trust the right people. Not everyone on the force is dirty." Marcus sat in his dimly lit living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. The glow of the screen illuminated his furrowed brow as he sifted through old news articles and records about the Briarwood Police Department. The more he dug, the more he found. Reports of misconduct that had been quietly dismissed, cases where complaints had mysteriously disappeared. He paused on an article from years ago, featuring Ruth at a community protest against police brutality. She looked younger, her eyes fierce and determined, holding a sign that read "Justice for All." Marcus felt a swell of pride, but also concern. His mother had fought against the same corruption for decades. Her history of activism, now resurfacing in his investigation, seemed like the key. That's why they targeted her, Marcus muttered, piecing it together. It wasn't random. He leaned back, the weight of the discovery settling in. The attack on his mother wasn't just an act of aggression. It was retaliation. The corrupt officers, including Crowley, must have seen her as a threat, someone who wouldn't stay silent. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed Detective Miles. "Harold, it's Marcus. I need to know more about Crowley. How deep does this go?" Miles's voice was cautious. "I told you before, Marcus, this isn't just one officer. There's a whole network protecting guys like Crowley. They have people in high places. I found old reports about my mother's activism," Marcus said. "She's been standing up to them for years." "That's exactly why they want to silence her," Miles replied. "But if you're going to dig deeper, you need to be prepared for what you might find. These people don't play fair." "Neither do I," Marcus said, determination hardening his tone. As the call ended, Marcus knew he needed allies. There was only one person he could think of, an old friend who knew how to navigate dangerous waters. Marcus entered the Veterans Center, the smell of stale coffee and old furniture greeting him. The walls were lined with photographs of soldiers, some smiling, some staring solemnly at the camera. This was a place of brotherhood, where soldiers could find solace and support. He scanned the room until his eyes settled on a familiar figure, Caleb Stokes, his former squad mate. "Caleb," Marcus called, walking over. Caleb looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes. "Marcus, it's been a while." They shook hands, their grip firm but friendly. "What brings you here?" Marcus glanced around before speaking. "I need your help. Something happened to my mom." Caleb's expression shifted to concern. "What happened?" Marcus explained the situation, from Crowley's attack to his discovery of the police's corruption. Caleb listened, nodding slowly, but there was a hesitation in his eyes. "I'm sorry, man. That's rough." "Rough doesn't cover it," Marcus replied, his voice tight. "I need to know if you've heard anything about the cops in this town." "You've always had your ear to the ground." Caleb sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, Marcus, I get where you're coming from, but this is dangerous. These guys, they're not just bad cops. They're connected." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You know something, don't you?" Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "I know enough to tell you to back off. For your own good." Marcus's suspicion deepened. "Why are you so eager for me to drop this? We fought for each other's lives. What happened to having my back?" Caleb looked down, avoiding Marcus's gaze. "It's not that simple anymore." Frustrated, Marcus stood. "Fine. If you're not going to help me, I'll find someone who will." As he walked away, Caleb called out, "Be careful, Marcus. Some things are better left buried." Marcus paused but didn't look back. Caleb's warning rang in his ears as he left the center, but he couldn't afford to stop now. He needed answers, and he suspected Miles was the only one willing to provide them. Marcus met Detective Miles in a dimly lit parking garage, away from prying eyes. Miles handed over a manila folder. "This is everything I could dig up without raising suspicion." Marcus opened the folder, scanning the pages. It was a treasure trove of corruption. Reports of excessive force, intimidation tactics, and even mysterious disappearances of key witnesses. His mother's name appeared multiple times, each instance tied to protests and complaints she had filed. "Why didn't anyone do anything?" Marcus asked, anger boiling in his voice. Miles shrugged, his expression grim. "Every time someone tries to investigate, evidence goes missing, or they get reassigned. It's a pattern." Marcus flipped through the documents until he found a photo of Crowley, standing beside a group of officers. At the center was a man with a familiar face, Colonel Richter, his commanding officer from his military days. Richter? Marcus whispered, shock freezing him in place. Miles nodded. He's involved, Marcus. Your mother's not just facing a corrupt department. She's up against someone with serious power. Marcus's hands trembled as he closed the folder. This was planned. They targeted her because of her activism, and because of me. Miles placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. You're in dangerous territory. If you go any further, there's no turning back. Marcus's jaw clenched. I'm not backing down. Fueled by anger and a need for answers, Marcus stormed to the police station. He waited outside until he saw Crowley exit, his eyes scanning the street as if he was on edge. Marcus stepped in front of him, blocking his path. We need to talk, Marcus said, his tone cold. Crowley's hand instinctively moved to his holster. Back off, Patterson. You don't know what you're getting into. I know enough, Marcus replied. I know you attacked my mother on purpose, and I know you're taking orders from someone higher up. Crowley's eyes darted around nervously. You don't know anything. Walk away before you regret it. Marcus leaned in, his voice low. Why? So you can hurt more innocent people? Or are you afraid of what I might find? For a moment, Crowley's mask slipped and fear flickered in his eyes. You're in over your head, he hissed. Powerful people are watching you. If you don't stop, they'll come for you and your mother. Marcus didn't flinch. Let them try. As Crowley turned and walked away, Marcus watched him go, his heart pounding. He had rattled the officer, but it was clear that the deeper he dug, the more dangerous this would become. From across the street, Caleb watched the exchange, his face unreadable. Later that night, Marcus rushed to the hospital after receiving a frantic call from a nurse. Ruth's condition had suddenly worsened. When he arrived, he found her hooked up to machines, her breathing labored. What happened? Marcus demanded. The doctor pulled him aside. We found traces of a toxin in her system. It's rare, something I've only seen in military cases. Marcus's blood ran cold. What kind of toxin? It's a nerve agent used for covert operations. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Marcus clenched his fists, his mind racing. He knew that the toxin wasn't just an attack, it was a message. The people behind this were sending a warning. He stood beside Ruth's bed, his hand gripping hers tightly. I promise you, Mom, I'm going to find out who did this. As Ruth's eyes flickered open, she squeezed his hand weakly. Be careful, Marcus, she whispered. They're dangerous. I know, Marcus said, his voice filled with resolve. But I won't let them get away with it. Marcus stood in the shadow of the Veterans Center, his eyes scanning the dimly lit alley. Caleb emerged, his expression guarded. Why did you want to meet here? Caleb asked, his voice low. Marcus stepped forward, his face etched with frustration. I know you're involved, Caleb. I know you're hiding something. Caleb's eyes darted around nervously. I told you before, Marcus. Drop this. You don't know what you're getting into. Too late for that, Marcus snapped. My mother's life is on the line and now, I found out there was poison involved, military grade. Caleb's face paled. What are you saying? Marcus held Caleb's gaze. You know exactly what I'm saying. This isn't just about corrupt cops. Someone's pulling strings, and you know who it is. Caleb looked away, his jaw clenched. You have no idea what's at stake. Then tell me. Marcus's voice rose. We fought side by side. Don't lie to me now. Caleb's shoulders slumped, and he let out a long breath. Fine. You want the truth? There's a man, Colonel Richter. He's the one orchestrating all of this. I'm working for him, but not by choice. What do you mean? Marcus's eyes narrowed. He has leverage on me, Caleb admitted. Things from our time in service. I'm trapped, Marcus. If I don't follow orders, I'm finished. Marcus's expression darkened. So you've been spying on me? Caleb nodded, shame written across his face. I didn't have a choice. Marcus took a step back, processing the betrayal. We're going to find a way out of this, Caleb. But I need you to help me. We need to bring him down. Caleb hesitated, then finally nodded. All right, but it won't be easy. Richter isn't just a man with power. He's a man with connections, That night, Caleb arranged a clandestine meeting at an old warehouse on the outskirts of Briarwood. Marcus entered the building cautiously, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. A lone figure emerged from the shadows, Colonel Richter. "Well, if it isn't Sergeant Patterson," Richter greeted, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've heard you've been making waves." Marcus's fist clenched. "You poisoned my mother." Richter shrugged. "She's become a liability. And now, so have you." "Why?" Marcus demanded. "What's this all about?" Richter's eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating look. "Your mother's activism has been a thorn in my side for years. And you? Well, you just had to dig, didn't you?" Marcus's face was a mask of fury. "This isn't going to end the way you think." Richter smiled, but it was devoid of warmth. "That depends on you. Walk away, and your mother gets to live out her days in peace. Continue down this path, and she won't be so lucky." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I won't back down." Richter's eyes darkened. "Then you'll face the consequences. Make no mistake, Patterson. You're in way over your head." As Richter turned and disappeared into the shadows, Marcus felt the weight of the threat. The stakes were higher than ever, and now it was personal. Marcus returned to the hospital, his mind racing with what Richter had said. Ruth was sitting up, her eyes weary but alert. When she saw Marcus's expression, concern clouded her face. "What happened?" Marcus hesitated, but finally spoke. "I met the man behind all of this, Mom. Colonel Richter." Ruth's eyes widened. "Richter. I've heard that name before. He's been targeting you because of your activism," Marcus explained. "He's trying to silence you and now me." Ruth's hand trembled as she reached out for his. "Marcus, you need to be careful. They won't stop until they get what they want." Marcus's grip tightened. "I'm not giving up, Mom. Not now." Tears welled up in Ruth's eyes. "I've been fighting this battle for years, Marcus. It's dangerous. I don't want you to lose your life for this." He shook his head. "I'm not losing anything. We're going to expose them." Ruth's eyes softened, but fear lingered. "Just promise me you'll stay safe." Marcus forced a smile, but the determination in his eyes remained. "I promise." Later that night, Marcus and Caleb drove to the abandoned warehouse, following a lead about Richter's operations. As they entered the dark, musty space, Marcus's senses were on high alert. "This place feels like a setup," Caleb muttered, glancing around. "Stay close," Marcus replied, gripping the flashlight tightly as they moved deeper into the building. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed around them. Before Marcus could react, masked men emerged from the shadows, surrounding them. Marcus fought back, throwing punches and dodging blows. But there were too many. "Marcus, run!" Caleb shouted, as he was tackled to the ground. Marcus hesitated for a split second, torn between helping his friend and escaping. "Go," Caleb insisted, struggling against the men restraining him. With a heavy heart, Marcus sprinted for the exit, narrowly dodging the masked attackers. As he reached the outside, he heard Caleb's shouts fade. Marcus knew Caleb had bought him time, but it meant Caleb was now in their hands. Back at Ruth's house, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his mind racing. Detective Miles sat across from him, studying a map of Briarwood. "You were right," Marcus said, his voice tinged with regret. "Richter's pulling the strings, and Caleb's caught in the middle." Miles nodded, his expression grim. "We need to act fast. If they have Caleb, they'll try to use him against you." Marcus's eyes burned with determination. "We're going to expose them. We'll use the media and the evidence we've gathered to force their hand." Miles hesitated. "Are you sure? This could make you a bigger target." "I don't have a choice," Marcus said. "It's the only way to get Caleb back and protect my mother." Miles nodded, finally seeing the resolve in Marcus's eyes. "All right, but we need to do this carefully. We'll leak the information to the press, and when the story breaks, we'll have the public on our side." As they finalized their plan, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead was dangerous, but it was the only way to bring justice to those who had tried to silence his mother and destroy his life. Marcus stood at the edge of Maplewood Park, looking out at the crowd that had gathered. Activists, friends, and local community members filled the space, holding signs and chanting. It was a powerful sight, but Marcus felt the weight of what was about to happen. Ruth had urged him to be cautious, but there was no turning back now. Detective Miles joined him, nodding at the growing crowd. "This is your chance, Marcus. Make it count." Marcus took a deep breath and stepped up to the makeshift podium. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying over the noise. "This isn't just about my mother. It's about all of us. We've been quiet for too long, and today, we're demanding justice." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy fueling Marcus's resolve. The police department in this town has been hiding its crimes, covering for officers like Ethan Crowley. But today, we expose the truth. We won't be silenced. As the crowd's chants grew louder, Marcus spotted reporters setting up cameras. The eyes of the town, and soon the country, were on him. He knew the risks, but he also knew this was their only shot. After the rally, as the crowd dispersed, Marcus was approached by a familiar face. Ethan Crowley emerged from the shadows, his face pale and eyes wide. Marcus felt the tension as they locked gazes. "Marcus," Ethan began, his voice low. "We need to talk." "There's nothing left to say," Marcus replied, his tone cold. "I'm exposing everything." Ethan's hands trembled. "You don't understand. If you keep pushing, they'll come after your mother again. But if you stop now, I can protect her. I can make sure she's safe." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "And how do I know you won't turn on us the moment I drop this?" Ethan's desperation was evident. "Look, I know I messed up, but it's not just me. Richter and his people, they control everything. I'm just a pawn like you. Then why work for them?" Marcus shot back. "Why hurt innocent people?" Ethan's expression tightened. "I don't have a choice. They know things about me, things that could ruin my life." Marcus shook his head. "You had a choice, and you chose wrong." "I'm not backing down." Ethan's face hardened. "I tried to warn you." He turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Marcus with a sense of foreboding. The rally had made waves, and Marcus knew Richter wouldn't let it go unchallenged. That evening, as he and Caleb coordinated their next steps from Ruth's house, they heard the sounds of sirens in the distance. The two exchanged a look. "They're coming," Caleb said, his voice grim. Marcus nodded. "We're ready." As police vehicles surrounded the house, Marcus and Caleb moved swiftly, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Marcus grabbed a phone, ready to live-stream the raid. "We're not hiding anymore. The world's going to see this." The door burst open, and officers stormed in. Marcus held up the phone, recording everything as Richter's men tried to drag him and Caleb out. "This is the Briarwood Police Department, the people who are supposed to protect us," Marcus shouted. But instead, they silenced those who speak out. The crowd outside, many of whom had remained after the rally, began to react. Anger surged through the people as they pushed back against the officers, turning the raid into a chaotic standoff. Marcus continued recording, determined to make their struggle visible. Caleb fought alongside him, helping hold back the officers. "We have to get out of here," Caleb urged. "This is turning into a riot." Marcus nodded, but he knew they had made an impact. The crowd's outrage had turned the tide. They managed to break free, blending into the throng of people as the police struggled to regain control. Later that night, Marcus and Miles gathered in a safe location, a friend's apartment far from the chaos. They set up a live stream, connecting with a network of activists who had been waiting for the signal. Miles clicked a button, and footage of the raid, along with the documents they had gathered, began streaming to their audience. Marcus spoke directly into the camera, his face resolute. "This is the truth about Briarwood. This is what they've been hiding. They tried to silence my mother, and they've threatened anyone who speaks up." As the footage played, Marcus felt the weight of the moment. His heart pounded, but he knew this was their chance. "We won't stop until every one of them is held accountable," he declared. Within minutes, the live stream went viral. News outlets picked up the footage, and social media exploded with support. Calls for justice echoed across the platform as more people rallied behind Marcus and Ruth's cause. Miles leaned over. "This is it, Marcus. We've got them on the ropes." But Marcus knew the fight was far from over. "Let's hope it's enough." The following day, Ruth, her strength returning, insisted on attending a community meeting at the park. Marcus tried to dissuade her, but Ruth was determined. "This is my fight too," she said. "I need to speak." As she took the stage, the crowd fell silent. Ruth's voice, though weakened, was clear and full of conviction. "For years, I've fought for justice in this community. I've seen the best and worst of people. But today, I see a town ready to stand together." The crowd cheered, and Ruth continued, her eyes shining. "They tried to silence me, and they tried to silence my son. But we're still here, and we won't be quiet anymore." Tears streamed down Marcus's face as he watched his mother, proud and unyielding. Ruth's speech was the spark that united the community, turning their fight into a movement. "Today, we take a stand," Ruth declared, "not just for ourselves, but for every voice that's been silenced." As the crowd erupted into applause, Marcus felt hope swell within him. They had the community's support, and they were closer than ever to exposing the corruption that had plagued Briarwood for years. The following morning, the town of Briarwood buzzed with a tense energy. News outlets filled the airwaves with reports of corruption in the police department, spurred by the footage and documents Marcus and Miles had released. Crowley's mugshot flashed on the screen, and Marcus felt a grim satisfaction. He watched from a distance as officers led Crowley out of the station in handcuffs. The crowds outside the building jeered, some shouting for justice. Ethan's expression was pale, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Marcus knew this was just the beginning, but it was a victory nonetheless. Detective Miles approached him, his face a mixture of relief and caution. "One down, but Richter and his men are still out there." Marcus nodded. "This isn't over until we get them all." Miles sighed. "The higher-ups are feeling the pressure now. They've launched an internal investigation, but Richter's covered his tracks well. He's gone underground." Marcus's jaw clenched. "Then we find him ourselves." Miles's eyes narrowed. "I hope you know what you're doing. This is dangerous territory." Marcus looked out at the crowd, feeling their energy fueling his resolve. "We have no other choice." Later that evening, Marcus and Caleb tracked Richter to an abandoned shipping yard on the outskirts of town. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant echo of machinery. Marcus's pulse quickened as they moved through the maze of containers, weapons at the ready. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Caleb whispered. Marcus nodded. "Miles traced his last call here. Stay alert." They moved deeper into the yard, and soon enough, Marcus spotted movement. Richter, flanked by two of his men, was talking on his phone. Marcus motioned for Caleb to split off, circling around for a pincer move. As they crept closer, Marcus could hear Richter's voice, cold and calculating. "They think they can expose us, but we'll disappear before they even get close. We have resources." Marcus stepped out, weapon raised. "Drop it, Richter." Richter turned, surprise flashing across his face before it twisted into a sneer. "Patterson, I should have known you'd be this stubborn." "Game's over," Marcus said. "We've exposed everything. There's no place left for you to hide." Richter's men moved, but Caleb emerged from behind, weapon trained on them. "Don't even think about it." Richter laughed, but there was an edge of desperation. "You think you've won? You've just become another casualty in a war you can't win." Marcus's eyes were steely. "I'm not the one running." Richter's hand moved to his waist, and before Marcus could react, the colonel drew his weapon. A shot rang out, but Marcus dove behind a container, returning fire. Caleb engaged the other men, a fierce firefight breaking out in the confined space. The sound of gunfire echoed through the yard. Marcus's heart pounded as he advanced, dodging behind cover. He finally got a clear shot and fired, hitting Richter's shoulder. The colonel stumbled, his weapon falling from his hand. "Don't move," Marcus shouted, stepping forward, his gun aimed squarely at Richter. Richter clutched his wounded shoulder, his eyes burning with rage. "This isn't over, Patterson." Marcus's grip tightened on his gun. "It is for you." Before Marcus could react, one of Richter's men charged, tackling him to the ground. They grappled, fists flying, as Caleb engaged the other. The two veterans fought side by side, their military training kicking in. Marcus managed to land a blow that sent his attacker sprawling. But Richter, seeing his chance, bolted for a nearby car. Caleb, bleeding from a cut on his arm, shouted, "He's getting away!" Marcus jumped to his feet, sprinting after the car. He aimed and fired, hitting the tire. The vehicle skidded, crashing into a pile of crates. Richter stumbled out, dazed and trying to flee, but Marcus was on him in an instant. He tackled Richter to the ground, pinning him down. "Not this time," Marcus hissed, cuffing him with the zip ties they had prepared. Caleb approached, clutching his injured arm. "Nice shot." Marcus grinned, but the relief was short-lived. "We need to get out of here." More of his men could show up. As they secured Richter and grabbed his laptop, the final piece of evidence they needed, Marcus felt a surge of hope. This was it. They had the proof to bring down the entire network. Back in Briarwood, the evidence Marcus and Caleb had gathered was broadcasted across every news channel. The footage of Richter's arrest and the incriminating files from his laptop became the breaking news of the day. The police department, under immense public pressure, had no choice but to make sweeping changes. The corrupt officers, including those who had tried to cover for Richter, were suspended pending investigation. At the hospital, Ruth watched the news unfold from her bed, tears streaming down her face. Marcus stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "We did it, Mom." Ruth looked up at him, her eyes filled with pride. "You've done so much, Marcus. I always knew you had this strength in you." Marcus smiled, but there was a hint of sadness. "It's not over. We still have work to do." Detective Miles joined them, a small smile on his face. "I think it's safe to say the tide has turned. With this evidence, the city's officials have no choice but to clean house." Caleb, his arm in a sling, nodded. "It's a start." Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the fight lifting. "It's more than a start. It's a new beginning." A few weeks later, Marcus and Ruth strolled through Maplewood Park, the place where everything had started. The park felt different now, alive with children playing and people laughing, the shadows of that terrible day finally lifting. Ruth paused, looking up at the tall oak trees swaying gently in the breeze. "This is what we fought for," she said softly. "A place where people can feel safe." Marcus squeezed her hand. "And we'll keep fighting for you, for this community." As they walked, they passed a mural painted on the side of a building, a tribute to the community's fight for justice. Ruth's face was among those depicted, a symbol of resilience and strength. Marcus smiled, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. They stopped by a bench, the same one Ruth had sat on before the attack. She sat down, looking out at the park. "This isn't the end, Marcus. This is just the beginning." Marcus nodded. "I know, and I'm ready for whatever comes next."